I must say it's been a real pleasure listening to all the speakers and having conversations with so many people here the last day and a half, and just learning about the amazing work that you're each doing in your own communities, research that you're doing in an area that's just very close to my heart. I've been doing research in First Nations and Métis nutrition for over 15 years now, so it's wonderful to be in a room of such like-minded people. I'm going to put my bio over here. Sorry, it's a bit long. And I don't know, should I use this, or Matt, can I ask you to forward? Is that okay? Okay. So just to go to the next slide, maybe. There's a lot of this information that's already been covered, I think better than I can probably cover it by other speakers, and I think just in knowledge of time, I think maybe I'll skip over some of this. It's always helpful for me, though, too, when I'm teaching about this. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Western University in the Indigenous Health Lab currently. So I've been teaching some courses the last little while on Indigenous environment. So I always like to have a long section of my course on traditional foods and Indigenous foods. So I think I do this for myself, but I do this for my students as well, to remind myself of the definition that I use for traditional foods. And I like to refer to them as plants and animals that are harvested from the local environment. And I know there's been some discussion in the last few days on just terminologies for traditional foods, if it should be country foods, foods from the land, wild meats, just different classifications of different types of foods. But I like to refer to it as, give it that general definition, because I think it includes, as we've been discussing, a wide variety of foods, some commodity foods, things that were introduced after European contact as well. Next slide. I also just think it's really interesting, too. This is a slide that I often show my students. I think it's a really colorful slide, but it just shows you, it just actually gives a glimpse of the real variety that there is, not just here in North America, I think, but globally in terms of traditional foods. As Bernadette mentioned, I had the privilege of working in northeastern Brazil a long time ago on traditional medicines and some of the plants that are harvested there. The red berries on the left-hand side of the slide there are called pitinga. From northeastern Brazil, extremely high vitamin C content. That's something that's harvested from the wild, from the lands that haven't been taken over with sugarcane plantations. You'll probably recognize some of the North American plants I have. There's clams, dandelion, wattle seed in the center there is a food that's used quite often by Indigenous Australians. Wild rice there on the right-hand upper corner, taro in the center that's used extensively throughout the Hawaiian Islands and the Pacific. And then I don't know, does anybody recognize the fruit there, that greenish fruit that's just underneath the wild rice? It's something that's actually grown in the area where I live now in southwestern Ontario. It's called a pawpaw fruit, and it's indigenous to that area. A long time ago, actually, we're doing a tour with one of the organizations that I work with in London, a tour of an old pawpaw grove that still exists in the Munsee, Delaware Reserve. And it's kind of like a custard apple. It's the size of about a mango, but it's really custardy and delicious and sweet inside. So next slide. I think I'm preaching to the choir here. I think everybody knows about this global condition that's been happening around us. I think not just here in North America, but internationally as well. This nutrition transition from locally acquired foods to market foods, and I think we've discussed this quite a bit, the ramifications that it has for health. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit more about ramifications in terms of cultural integrity and transmission of Indigenous knowledge. Next slide. I think I'm just going to skip over these. I think everybody knows, everybody in this room anyway, the amazing benefits that wild foods have. For example, rose hips here, the amount of vitamin C. I think Teresa was referring to that as well. Next slide. As well as some of the wild meats, the amount of heme iron, as well as protein that's present in deer meat compared to an old favorite down at the bottom there, bologna. So next slide. So traditional food systems, people have been talking about this as well. I often try and define this for my classes. Just to reiterate, traditional food systems include not only food preferences and dietary patterns of cultural groups, they also involve the physical, social, cultural, as well as the historical environments making up each food system, and just to bear this in mind. Next slide. So in addition, as I touched on, this nutrition transition and all the health implications that we've been discussing the last day and a half, so in addition to those health implications, I'd like you just to focus on the left-hand side of the slide there, the cultural implications for many Indigenous peoples, such as the negative impacts on cultural practices that are central to each unique traditional food system and are also far-reaching. So I'm just going to focus more today on, there's so much I could talk about here, on the first point there under culture, the transfer of Indigenous knowledge to the next generation. So with these global patterns in mind, I'm going to dial back a little bit. I think about 14 years now, when I set out as a very naive master's student at the University of Manitoba to investigate changes in First Nation women's dietary patterns during pregnancy. And I chose to do this by doing qualitative interviews with two generations, mothers and grandmothers, from a community in the Interlake region of Manitoba, Peguis First Nation. That's, for those of you who are from Manitoba, you may recognize Chief Peguis there. That's before he had his nose cut off in a fight. So he was looking much better there in that depiction. So the interviews that I conducted both unstructured and semi-structured interviews with the two generations, and I asked them about food preferences when they were pregnant, as well as the availability and access of foods in their particular community in the Interlake there. Both of the generations talked about the importance of traditional foods and teachings when they were pregnant and raising their young families, as well as issues having to do with food insecurity in that area. The generations, however, and this was most interesting to me, did not appear to be talking to each other. They were talking to me, but they didn't seem to be talking to each other about their experiences and struggles. In particular, the grandmothers that I spoke to did not seem to feel comfortable about sharing their knowledge with the younger generation. And just go to the next slide there. So really, it was through this research project in Peguis that I conducted many years ago. I really came to learn more about the dramatic changes in food acquisition patterns that had really just taken place over 50 years' time there, really a very short period of time, and the important role that elders play in transmitting Indigenous knowledge to younger generations, and something that wasn't happening at that time in that community. According to the grandmothers, during that time, there was also, I learned that there was a growing concern about these ties, the ties between youth and elders, that they had disintegrated over this time. This is also a community that was transferred in the early 1900s. Their land was taken away, the very, very arable agricultural land along the Red River. They were relocated to the Interlake region. So it was suggested that it was perhaps due to that. But the grandmothers really felt that the young women were disinterested in what they had to say, and as a result, their Indigenous knowledge, or the knowledge that they carried with them, was being lost. So next slide. I just included a quote here, an example of one of the grandmothers. She was 68 years old at the time when I talked to her several years ago. And as you can see by the quote here, she was very frustrated with the younger generation's disdain for learning how to prepare and eat wild meats. As she said, some of them turned their nose up at the food, and I said, "It's better than you're buying at that store." I said, "That's good food. You know what the animals ate, and they're clean." I said, "All of them brings up all the fat and the different things in there. You don't know. So you can really tell by this quote how frustrated she was that she really didn't feel like she had a voice, but she was observing these changes that were happening. Next slide. So fast forward here to 2008. This is a study that took place as I was finishing up my PhD research, also in Manitoba. And it's a food choice study that was conducted in 2010 in London with researchers at Western University by my postdoctoral supervisor now, Dr. Chantal Richmond. And so my current research is sort of building on this work that Chantal started and the results of my master's research by exploring contemporary health inequalities related to traditional food knowledge, this time in southwestern Ontario. So as I mentioned, this project's an extension of an earlier collaborative research project between SOHAC, there stands for the Southwest Ontario Aboriginal Health Access Centre. It's a mouthful, I'll refer to it as SOHAC from now on. And as I said, with researchers from Western University. So the study, the food choice study, began in 2008 to look at food practices, food security, and sources of food, looking at urban and on-reserve families in southwestern Ontario. Next slide. So just before I start talking about what I've been doing this last year during my postdoc, I'll just give you some of the results. There was a qualitative as well as a quantitative component to the food choice study, and this is some of the data from the survey or the quantitative part. So there was 230 families that were surveyed for this part of the study, and they revealed that urban and reserve-based First Nations families in this region, not surprisingly, are frequently experiencing food insecurity, with urban First Nations families more often describing circumstances of poverty associated with food insecurity, as well as more limited access to traditional foods. So I don't know if you can see very well there. What I've tried to circle there is the non-existent bar. The first bar is there. The 15% there is referring to families on reserve, reported rarely or not very often consuming traditional foods. That's the urban population compared to none at all. So families on reserve reported never having to worry about having access to traditional foods, although only about 25% of those consume traditional foods 2 to 5 times a week, compared to the urban population there who really seem to have more trouble accessing it. So next slide, in terms of preferences then, participants were asked as part of this survey, would you prefer to eat traditional foods more often than you do now? And it was interesting that a huge proportion, almost 75% of the urban sample said that they would, compared to only 52% of those on reserve, which corresponds well to the previous data. And then another, next slide. Another question we asked was for participants to list specific traditional foods that they would like to consume more frequently. And you can see here there's a difference between the reserve and urban populations. The urban bar is the red bar there, I think, and the blue is on reserve. It's just interesting to note the preferences, however, wild meat, such as venison, wild fish, as well as wild rice, were consistently proportionate across the groups. Next slide. So participants were also asked to list traditional foods they ate with their families most often. And it's also interesting, I think this corresponds well to that wild meat, cornbread, as well as berries were reported to be more frequently concerned by families living off reserve compared to different types of foods such as corn soup, bannock, Indian tacos, wild rice, beans, and fish. So even just these types of foods, I thought you might find interesting because they're a little bit different than some of the ones that we've been talking about, especially in terms of the corn product, as Teresa was mentioning earlier. It's quite commonly referred to, the Indian corn anyway, as a traditional food. Next slide. So this is the last bar graph, I promise. So participants were also asked what factors prevented them from consuming traditional foods, and this is what we're really quite interested in. For those living on reserve, and the colors have changed here, so for those living on reserve, that's the red bars there. Preparation time and preference were the key limitations that were expressed by the participants compared to those families living in an urban center. The blue bars there were challenged more, as was revealed in some of the other questions too, by access and availability issues, in addition to the expense, as we were talking about earlier, of traditional foods living off reserve. Next slide. So in addition to the survey that was conducted, as I mentioned, there were qualitative interviews that took place with 25 urban and on-reserve First Nations mothers. And these interviews revealed that food security in their communities is dependent on access to knowledge, including Indigenous knowledge, contact with elders, as well as cultural capacity around food. So building on these initial results that are currently being reviewed as publications, hopefully they'll be out soon. My current research is working on reanalyzing these interviews, along with conducting life history interviews with 25 female elders from the corresponding communities to look at generational changes. And those are my main objectives. I've got 5 minutes here, so I'm not going to take the time to go over them. Okay, and I think everybody's aware of this. The intergenerational trauma that Bossy and others have talked about, this is something that I'm hoping, my hypothesis is that chronic food insecurity may be associated with cultural loss resulting from intergenerational trauma of residential schools in these communities. So next slide. So these are some results from my initial secondary analysis of the qualitative data. And interestingly, it supports the quantitative information from the First Nations mothers that also participated. That was a subsample of women that participated in these qualitative interviews. So as you can see by some of these points here, many families expressed the desire for more consistent access to foods in the urban center and discussed barriers such as cost, as well as lack of transportation, as well as time and knowledge. And I would say 72% of the women that we interviewed for the qualitative studies were single parents and really didn't have very much support living in an urban environment. And I just have a quote, the next slide, from one of the women. This is from a single mom. She's a 26-year-old Oneida woman. And she's been living in London with 3 children. And when she was asked if she found where she lives makes it more challenging for her to eat traditional food, she said, "It's harder, especially on the reserve. It's harder, especially when on the reserve. You're closer to family. And if someone was cooking or if we're going to make stuff, we could do it together. In the city, we're all scattered around." And she also said it would be easier if I could do it myself, make these traditional foods, to learn how to make things on my own, but I haven't had very many teachers. So secondary analysis from those women, about half of the women that participated in the qualitative interviews were from the urban centre of London, Ontario. Half were from Chippewa and the Thames and Munsee reserves outside of London. So comparatively, mothers living on reserves seem to talk less about access issues such as barriers to the increased consumption to traditional foods. They really talked more about preferences and the health properties of food. And also they had similar environmental concerns, primarily about wild meat compared to fish for those people living in the urban center or close to the Thames River. So just an example of one of the quotes. One woman was asked if her family would like to eat more traditional foods, and this 26-year-old woman who is from Chippewa and the Thames Reserve, as well as living as a single parent with 1 child, said, "I think in a way my family prefers traditional foods because it's always been there and it's kind of entrenched in you that originally that's what you like. I don't know many people that don't like it, but it's one of those things. It's something exciting when you're going to eat it because you don't eat it that often." So really just talking about more preferences as well compared to access and barrier issues. So next slide. I'll try to go through this as quick as I can. So as we've been talking about too, engaging in research and engaging with communities, As I'm reanalyzing these interviews, I'm seeking input from SOHAC staff, both in the center of London. There's several SOHAC sites. One that I'm working with primarily is that on Chippewa and the Thames First Nation reserves, as well as community representatives in reanalyzing the data. They're also involved right now. Actually, I'm meeting with them tomorrow morning in London to help design questions for the life history interviews that are due to take place this summer with elders. And the communities have already expressed the desire for the dissemination of the overall results through a community feast, as well as cooking demonstrations to take place both on and off reserve. And they've also discussed the development of a resource book that'll include stories, photographs, as well as recipes from the participating communities. Last couple slides. So building on the findings and recommendations from the initial study and these ongoing studies, plans are also currently underway that will utilize a really great site called the Garden Learning Center that's located at SOHAC site on Chippewa and the Thames First Nation Reserve as a multi-purpose educational resource center. The overall vision of these research projects is therefore to inform a community-led traditional teachings program that will foster various opportunities for the sharing, uptake, and practice of IK as it relates to traditional foods among urban and reserve-based First Nations families. Next slide. And this is just an example of something that's taking place in a couple of weeks. Learning how to make corn soup the real way, the old-fashioned way, the way that takes 2 days. It's a 2-day workshop. And in conclusion, I really appreciated that Terry brought up Winona LaDuke. She's also one of my heroes this morning, and this is a really amazing initiative that she and the Indigo Girls have put together, and it's the Honor of the Earth movement. And I would encourage all of you who are interested in this area, in the area of food sovereignty. There's funding available through this organization for community-based initiatives to revitalize traditional food practices, to go to that website. So final slide, thank you all very much. Thanks to the organizers, and thank you to all my supporters.